The Rigel Black Chronicles, Book 1, The Pureblood Pretense. Chapter 11. All week, Rigel felt the ghostly pressure of eyes tracing the lines of her back, but whenever she turned, no one was there. At first, she thought it was a ghost, except it seemed the height of hubris to imagine a ghost would find any interest in a human's day-to-day activity. Her shoulder blades ever a-twitch, she found herself moving stiffly, avoiding empty corridors and acting as uninteresting and uninjured as possible. She couldn't help but think it was her attacker, watching for weakness, waiting to get her alone again. Before Transfiguration on Thursday, she felt the eyes again, and this time she caught the flutter of a robe ducking back around a corner when she whirled. Rigel stopped in the middle of the corridor, caught in indecision. Should she pursue or try to lure them closer first? Zabini hung back from the group of Slytherin students to wait beside her. His dark eyes roved the empty corridor. "What is it?" "Nothing." Zabini raised an eyebrow. "Nothing made you suddenly separate yourself from Draco and Pansy? You three are as thick as Goyle's skull." "Were they?" Rigel supposed they spent nearly all their hours together. The stiff linen formality of their friendship had softened completely to malleable threads of common interest and allied affection. She knew that Draco liked Transfiguration because he found it uncommonly challenging, and that Pansy enjoyed astronomy even though she already knew most of what they were being taught. She'd even told them a bit about Sirius. Most telling, if she dared to admit it, she looked for them first whenever she entered a room. "I thought—" She tried to assess Zabini's expression, but it was unreadable. "I think someone was following us." Zabini let a wolf's knowing smile wax over his face. "You finally noticed. The blonde butterfly has been following you all week." "Butterfly?" Rigel took a step toward the corner, but a hand on her shoulder held her back. "They'll be gone by the time you get there." At her pointed look, he removed his hand with an apologetic smile. "Can you not hear the frantic beating of wings in flight?" She could indeed hear the sound of running footsteps fading quickly. Rigel pressed her lips together in frustration. "Why didn't you say anything sooner? Who was that?" "If you had not noticed eventually, you would not deserve to be warned." Zabini started toward the classroom. "As for who, I imagine you'll know soon enough." He held open the door expectantly. "You don't want to be late for the quiz, do you?" Rigel hurried inside, worry over a potential stalker taking back seat to the quiz she was about to fail. Rigel claimed the seat between Pansy and Draco, while McGonagall enchanted the questions onto the board. "You have 30 minutes to complete the short answer section. I will be asking each you to demonstrate a matchstick-to-needle transfiguration while you work. Please take out a blank sheet of parchment and begin." Professor McGonagall waved her wand, and their textbooks flew into a stack at the front of the room. Rigel worked steadily through the questions. They ranged from straightforward to theoretical. Name the 5 elemental laws of transfiguration. Is it harder to animate an inanimate object or the other way around? What classification of transfiguration might result in a beetle growing the nose of a mouse and a mouse losing its nose completely? All of it had been discussed in class and in their textbook. Her quill was down long before McGonagall reached their table for the practical demonstration. The professor placed a matchstick in front of Pansy first. "Please turn this into a needle, Miss Parkinson, and know that your grade is not based solely on the final result. Don't be nervous if you can't change it all the way." Pansy picked up her wand and waved it confidently, speaking the incantation clearly. Her match morphed slowly and smoothly into a needle until it sat in innocent perfection, as though it hadn't ever dreamed of being anything else. McGonagall picked it up, checking the hole and the point, and nodded approvingly. "Very good. You next, Mr. Black." Rigel studied her matchstick apprehensively before taking a deep breath and saying the incantation, automatically waving her wand in the complicated wrist movement over the match. It stayed a match. Professor McGonagall frowned and leaned in to get a better look at what Rigel was doing. She waved for Rigel to try again. Rigel was sure her incantation was perfect and her wand movement precise, but no transformation occurred. After the third time, McGonagall made a small in the back of her throat and said, "Take a moment to focus your intent, Mr. Black, while I test Mr. Malfoy." Draco shot her a worried look, then focused on his own match. He set his mouth in an uncompromising line and glared at it, speaking the spell forcefully. His matchstick seemed to hesitate for an instant, vibrating slightly as it wavered. Then all at once it became a shiny silver needle and lay still again. McGonagall inspected it, raising her eyebrows at the lethal-looking point. "Very nice, Mr. Malfoy." She turned to Rigel once more. "Mr. Black, if you would." Rigel performed the movement and said the words once more, unable to help feeling as though she was acting in a play about magical people, and not really a witch at all. She tried to mentally trick her magic into thinking she really wanted the match to be a needle, if for no other reason than to avoid the disappointed eyes of McGonagall, Pansy, and Draco, all of whom stared expectantly at the match, but no change occurred. It was still, and probably always would be, a match. The sinking feeling in her chest was familiar. Transfiguration wasn't the only class in which Rigel had a series of paralyzing practical difficulties. She did fine in herbology, history of magic, astronomy, and potions, but anything requiring wand work was impossible. Even the flying instructor had given her a disappointed look when she wobbled on her broom one-handed. McGonagall made a mark on her grading scroll. "I can give you points for the correct incantation and wand movement, Mr. Black, but you'd best hope you did well on the written portion of this quiz. I expect more effort from you in the future." McGonagall moved on, and Draco and Pansy gave her identical pitying looks. "You did everything right," Pansy said soothingly. "I'm sure it doesn't count for much of our grade anyway." "That's right," Draco added. There was a distinct lack of true conviction in his tone. "You'll be able to make it up later in the term." "Thanks," Rigel muttered, stowing her useless wand in her bag and trying to ignore the looks of her other classmates. "At least it's over with." Draco gave her a bracing smile. "And we've got double potions to look forward to tomorrow," Pansy said brightly. "That will take your mind off of it." Rigel smiled at them. "Thanks for lying to me. It helps." "Anytime," Draco said magnanimously. Pansy and Rigel exchanged amused looks, but Rigel's grin fell away when McGonagall said everyone was dismissed except her. Rigel waved her friends on and slowly shouldered her bag, picking her way through the tables to the professor's desk. "Yes, Professor?" "Mr. Black, I'm sorry to say that you were the only first year in all of my classes who was unable to effect even a partial transfiguration for this quiz." The older woman peered through her spectacles at Rigel. "Care to explain why you are so far behind?" "No, Professor." Her voice was a little tight in answering, but the frustration was hard to bottle. If Rigel could explain what was wrong with her magic, she might be halfway to fixing it. "It is as though you aren't trying at all, Mr. Black." McGonagall searched Rigel's expression. "I can understand if you were nervous to make the attempt in front of your friends. Would you like to try one more time now?" The older woman's eyes softened. "Your father was a gifted transfiguration student, you know." If she meant to help Rigel relax, the words had the opposite effect. She was not the son of Sirius Black, and sometimes she didn't even feel like a real Potter. Everyone in her family was brilliant with wand work. James, Lily, Remus, Sirius, 4 stars in a brilliant constellation. She knew they would be disappointed if they could see her, unable to manage even the simplest of spells. Her insides clamped down on every churning feeling, lest it betray something to the professor. Face carefully controlled, she said, "I don't really see the point." "Very well." Professor McGonagall's regard hardened. "If that is how you feel, I'm assigning you detention tomorrow night to be served with Mr. Filch at 7 o'clock. I hope that this, along with the poor score you will receive on your quiz today, will inspire you to take your studies a little more seriously." "Yes, Professor," Rigel said tonelessly. She accepted the detention slip, which gave the time and place of the remedial work, and left, the feeling in her chest only growing tighter. Her friends were waiting outside the classroom, and they made sympathetic noises when they saw the pink slip of paper in her hands. Pansy gave the closed classroom door a miffed look after reading the detention slip aloud. "How can she give you detention for a bad grade? The grade is punishment enough." "On Friday night too, and with Filch," Draco grimaced. "That's just cruel." "Friday." Pansy double-checked the slip. "You were supposed to meet a couple of my acquaintances that day. I'll have to introduce you another time, I suppose." "Sorry," Rigel offered, reclaiming the slip and tucking it into her bag. "It's not your fault." Her friend fluttered her fingers dismissively. "I mean, it is, but I don't blame you for getting detention on Friday specifically." "We've really got to fix whatever this is, though," Draco said as they began walking toward the dungeons. "If you keep failing practicals, everyone will think you're a squib." "Would you end our friendship if I was?" Rigel didn't know what made her ask. It was an impossible question, a test that wasn't about squibhood at all, but a much more dangerous secret that kept her awake some nights, listening to her roommates breathe as the guilt slowly ate her alive. Pansy and Draco shared a look that she wasn't pureblood enough to decipher. "We could remain friends," Pansy said slowly, "though it would become a great deal more difficult if the information got back to our parents." "Don't be morbid," Draco said firmly. He seemed to have forgotten that he brought it up in the first place. "You're not, so it doesn't matter. Let's go play Quidditch. Pansy can watch." Joy of all possible joys. Pansy raised her eyes briefly to the ceiling. "You'd best make it entertaining if I'm going to watch you flit about on an overgrown matchstick. Otherwise, we'll see if the needle transfiguration is scalable." Rigel's left wrist gave a peremptory throb at the thought of more flying, but the bulk of her mind was busy poking at an even more painful and less obvious injury. She turned over their answers in her mind and couldn't decide what to feel. Would they still be friends if Rigel's status as someone of lesser blood was revealed? They hadn't said no, but there'd been no unequivocal yes either. She supposed she shouldn't ask questions she didn't want to know the answer to. -0. Friday night's detention plucked a strange chord of memory from Rigel's childhood. Once she and Archie had accidentally uncovered the portrait of Sirius's mother in the attic. Archie cut himself on the frame, and his blood broke the sealing enchantment. The next thing they knew, the foul woman was alive and shrieking at them from her painted cage. The vitriol she spewed had shocked and frightened them. Rigel could perfectly recall the phosphoric rage in the painting's eyes, and she could only imagine how much more terrible Walburga Black had been in life. Her demented cackle still made appearances in Rigel's dreams. It was the only time she'd seen Sirius livid, and even as he lectured them about how long it had taken to seal the portrait and how dangerous it was, spilling a black heir's blood around so many old artifacts, she couldn't help but think he was more scared and ashamed than angry. He had carefully raised Archie out from under the cloud of blood prejudice, and here was his mother raining it down on his son anyway. As she polished plaques in the trophy room, Filch's disdainful muttering brought the memory floating to the surface of her mind, like foam on a sluggish tide. It wasn't the pitch or the words themselves, but the resentful cadence, like a mantra too often repeated, that gave her the uneasy feeling of being in the presence of one whose hatred had completely defined him. "Lazy students, privileged little brats!" The caretaker watched her work as though McGonagall was going to quiz him on Rigel's performance. The way he sneered at her, mumbling insults and complaints to his cat while making sure she heard every word, made her neck and shoulders tense with indignation. She couldn't go any faster with her left hand useless. She was already sore from bracing the trophies between her knees as it was. Squandering the magic nature gave him too good to study. Filch stroked his cat in languid passes. "Some real work will change his tune, my lovely. He'll see how good he has it now." She knew it was difficult to be a squib in their society. She knew it, and a part of her felt guilty for having used his disability to attempt to provoke an emotional reaction from Draco and Pansy the day before. But by the end of the night, her sympathy had hardened to something cold and ashamed in her stomach. She hadn't been trying to shirk her studies, had she? Maybe she hadn't thought the other classes all that important since it was potions she really wanted to learn. But Rigel, of all people, knew how precious her opportunity at Hogwarts was. She just didn't know how to convince her magic to rise to it with her. Filch released her only when the entire room was sparkling, and she dragged her sore body down past the entrance hall as the clock struck an hour with too many chimes to count. She was just starting down the stairs when she heard it, the faint echo of a single set of footsteps. It was past curfew. She had a detention slip, but no one else should be wandering the castle at that time of night. And prefects patrolled in pairs, not alone. Rigel didn't pause or give any indication she'd heard, but she made her own footsteps fainter. She felt like a child who had heard a noise in the dark, holding its breath and straining to hear an imagined monster's heavy shuffling. Except the footsteps came closer, so she wasn't imagining it at all. She turned the first corner in the dungeons and stopped, balling her courage into a fist. She would surprise them when they rounded the corner and finally get a look at their face. Her heart climbed over the rest of her organs, clamouring in her ears, an urgent roaring. A small sphere skittered around the corner and burst into a cloud of smoke. Rigel choked and ducked away from the spewing fog. The corridor became a churning swirl of black and white smoke, and it felt as though she was inside a crystal ball, some seer peering into her life, probably disappointed by her ignoble fate. A jet of light cut through the dense haze and hit the wall where her head would have if she hadn't bent at the waist in search of air. Ducking and hunching her shoulders, she scurried as fast as she could in the opposite direction. Before she made it around the next corner, a searing slice caught her in the back and propelled her forward to meet the hard stone. She ground out a scream when her broken wrist hit the floor, but fear pulled at her, stronger than the pain. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her throbbing left hand to her chest, and ran. Rigel's heart raced ahead of her, flying faster than her feet could carry it, and for a moment, under the spell of adrenaline, she could almost pretend she was chasing it and not running from anything at all. The dungeons sprawled beneath the foundations of the castle, wider than any of the floors above. If it was a fellow Slytherin chasing her, she didn't stand much hope of outrunning them. But with anyone else, Rigel had the home pitch advantage. She hadn't taken her book bag to detention and so didn't have the map to guide her, but she knew the corridors well enough to make a wide circle, as far from the common room as she could manage. After a while, her run turned into a slow walk. She flinched at every noise, imagined or real, and her heart took its sweet time coming back to settle in her chest where it belonged. Only when she was sure she had lost her attacker did she turn for the common room. Her lower back burned, but she couldn't see the impact site, so she wasn't sure what kind of spell had landed. It didn't immobilize her or turn her into anything unintelligible, at least. When the wall slid back, Rigel froze as nearly every eye in the common room turned her way. It was packed with students relaxing late on a Friday evening, and naturally everyone wanted to know who was out and about so brazenly past curfew. Most people, upon seeing the pink slip she still clutched numbly in her right hand, turned away again. Others let their eyes linger on her sweaty face and dishevelled robes. "Rigel, over here!" Draco and Pansy held their hands up so she could see them with the other first years by one of the fireplaces. Rigel stumbled over and sunk into a low-backed couch. She felt like a bathtub that had just been drained. Fear and adrenaline swirled in a sluggish spiral at the bottom of her stomach, and she was crusted in the scum of shame for having run. Pain had mostly gone with the rest of her emotions, but a few remaining bubbles popped slowly one at a time, a throb in her wrist, a burn at her back. Pansy moved to sit beside her, and Rigel flinched away with a gasp as the movement pulled at the couch and sent fire licking up her back. With a wordless noise of distress, Pansy pushed Rigel forward by the shoulder, moving the affected area away from the couch. "What in Morgana's name happened to your back, Rigel? You can see it? Your robes are sliced through," Pansy snapped. Come to that, she could feel the wash of air against her injury. "Someone shot a spell at me." Knott jumped up from his seat to get a better look. "Merlin, that's a nasty one." "What's it look like?" Rigel asked. "I can't see where it hit, but it burns." "Stinging hex," Knott said authoritatively. "It glanced up your back. Were you crouching?" Cowering, that's what she was doing, running away, her face heated. What would James and Sirius say? But Pansy only made a sound of wordless sympathy and clutched Rigel's shoulder in a silent promise. "Who did this to you?" Draco's eyes were hard, demanding answers. Rigel didn't have any. "I don't know." The blonde butterfly, Zabini, had the look of one attempting to reconcile facts that didn't fit together in his mind. She shrugged. "They sent a smoke bomb ahead, so I couldn't see who it was." Rigel made a face and extracted herself from Pansy's grip. Her skill pulled and itched, like an insect bite that went from her waist to the bottom of her shoulder blade. "I could ask one of the older students to heal it," Pansy offered. "If it's a stinging hex, it'll dissipate on its own," Rigel muttered. At least she thought it would. It wasn't exactly the kind of spell that got thrown around at home. She'd been on the receiving end of countless pranks growing up, but never one that hurt. Never one that made her feel so frightened that she panicked and ran for her life. And yet a smoke bomb was a prankster's weapon. Then there was the dung bomb. It confused her. Was this someone's poorly executed idea of a joke or an earnest attempt to hurt her? What kind of an honourless arse hexes a first year from behind? Draco's voice rose as his anger found an outlet, drawing curious looks from those sitting closest to their circle. "All I know is it wasn't a Slytherin. They couldn't keep up in the dungeons at all." "And they chased you through the dungeons?" Draco took to his feet, unable to properly express his outrage from a seated vantage. Only a Gryffindor would be so stupid and stoop so low in the first place. Adrian Pusey drifted into their circle, no doubt drawn by the commotion. "What's this, Black? A Gryffindor attacked you?" His question was louder even than Draco's outburst, and it cut through the surrounding conversation like a bludger. "Attacked? One of our first years?" "They wouldn't dare." "I don't know it was a Gryffindor," Rigel said. She was ignored. More students inserted themselves into their circle, most of them older, and all of them outraged on her behalf. Rigel wanted to shrink back into the furnishings, but instead she was prompted to stand and turn around so they could all see how she'd been hit while running away. "Someone get a prefect." "They're on rounds. What about Snape?" "I say we tell everyone." "Enough!" Rigel forced herself to stand tall despite the way it pulled at her still stinging back. "I don't know who hexed me. I don't know why, but I'm tired and I'm going to bed. Please, just let this be." Pusey gave her a sympathetic look. "It's out of your hands, Black. No one tries to gut a snake in our own dungeons. This has to be answered." "I don't want you all to do anything." The last thing she needed was for the teachers to descend on her with too much attention and probing questions. If they forced her to cooperate, it could lead to her explaining the other incidents, which could only lead to the hospital wing, the one place she dreaded in all the school. Pusey exchanged a silent look with the other older students, and then he set a hand on her shoulder comfortingly. "You don't need to know anything about it. Get some sleep. Let us take care of it." It was not the reassurance she was looking for, but it was clearly all she was going to get from them. Avoiding the eyes of her classmates, she made for her dorm room. The stinging hex would wear off in under an hour, but the stress of not knowing what her housemates were going to do in response to her attack kept her awake much longer. It was pleasantly cool the next day, with a cloudless sky and no wind to speak of. In other words, it was a perfect day for Quidditch. Draco grinned as he piled his plate with food, and alternatively turned to address Rigel, then Pansy, continuously checking to see that they were maintaining the appropriate level of excitement. "Of course, there won't be any tailwind, but since I have to fly in all directions, it wouldn't make much difference for me, anyway." Draco paused with a spoonful of carrots over his plate, realized there was no room left, and magnanimously dumped them onto Rigel's. "You like vegetables," he told her cheerfully. He dug into the feast he'd compiled as gracefully as anyone with that much food could. "Aren't you afraid you'll get sick eating all that?" Pansy asked, clearly struggling not to be appalled at the Malfoy scion's complete eschewal of table manners. Before Draco could try to answer with his mouth full, Rigel offered, "Seekers will probably try out last. He'll have time to digest, and there's no telling how long he might be in the air. Also," Draco added when he came up for air and pumpkin juice, "a Malfoy never gets sick." Pansy and Rigel shared a fond look. Flint stood lazily from his seat down the table, and every other player hopeful shot to their feet to follow him from the hall like sycophantic courtiers. "This is it." Draco set his utensils down deliberately and flashed them a confident, magazine-worthy grin. "Don't bother wishing me luck." He stood dramatically, but paused to look down at them expectantly before swinging his other leg over the bench. "You are coming to watch, right?" "We'll be there," Pansy assured him. "In fact, we'll be cheering so loudly you'll be embarrassed to know us." "I was not made aware of this plan." Rigel gave a regretful sigh. "If only I'd worn my Draco is the best possible choice T-shirt." Draco's eyes lit with Lumos charms from within, and her sarcasm glanced right off. "Great, I have to get ready, but come soon so you don't miss anything important." He left the Great Hall at a pace that would be called a run if he weren't a Malfoy. Generations of good breeding out the window as soon as Quidditch is mentioned. Pansy shook her head. "Boys!" Rigel remembered just in time that it would be strange if she nodded in agreement, so instead she returned with, "Spending hours in support of a friend, despite having absolutely no interest in the subject of his obsession. Girls." Pansy laughed. "Just remember, you two don't deserve me." "We'd never forget it." As her amusement subsided, Pansy looked sidelong at Rigel while toying with her cup. "Where were you this morning? You don't have to tell me," she added quickly, before Rigel could open her mouth. "I know you don't answer to me, but you've hardly disappeared at all this week, so I just wondered why suddenly." Rigel swallowed her bite of carrot slowly, trying to decide how to answer. The closer she stuck to the truth, the better. "I was in the library. I've been using the weekends to do some research." "You do homework with Draco and me during the week," Pansy said. It was not so much an accusation as a reminder of what Pansy already knew, what Rigel shouldn't bother to try and lie about, perhaps. "It's not for any of our assignments, just extra research, which I didn't think would interest you two." "You said you were kicked out of the library," Pansy said quietly. She looked as though she wanted to believe Rigel, but found it difficult. "I was, but I found a way around it." Rigel smiled gently. "I promise I don't have an exciting secret life that I'm hiding because I want to have all the fun to myself. It really is quite boring work." "Is it potions research?" "Some of it," Rigel admitted. "Technically, some of Flint's essays were about potions. I'm also trying to figure out what's going on with my magic." She wasn't really, but she injected enough real frustration in her voice that she didn't think Pansy would notice. "I don't fancy another detention." Her gracious friend allowed the conversation to be steered away without protest. "That's right. We never asked you how it went because of what happened last night. Was it awful?" "Tell you on the way to the pitch." Rigel stood and offered her arm. "If we're not there by the time the chasers start, Draco will fret." On their way down to the stadium, she and Pansy could see dozens of players flying above the stands in a wide circle. Their speeds varied, and more than one wobbled hopelessly in the air as faster, more confident players overtook them. They climbed the stands for a better view, and by the time they found their seats, Flint seemed to be separating the contingent of hopefuls into maybes and no way in hells. The latter group was banished to the stands to join the rest of the spectators, and Rigel and Pansy shared a relieved look when Draco stayed down on the pitch. He had survived the first hurdle at least. Flint's booming voice, magically magnified to an alarming degree, called chasers and keepers to try out first. Draco jogged to the side of the pitch with the other beaters and seekers, and Pansy waved exuberantly until he saw them and waved back. Rigel had to smile as the boys stood a little straighter under their supportive eyes. Draco was far from the only confident hopeful. The waiting players stood like a stable of restless horses, chomping to get airborne. As the chaser-keeper round drew to a close, however, most of them deflated like stuck balloons. Flint picked the same 3 chasers and keeper as last year. By the speed with which he chose, the tryout seemed a mere formality. Pansy gave Rigel a worried look. Draco strode onto the pitch as though he owned it, smile firmly in place and head held at just the right angle for the sunlight to catch his silver eyes. Pansy and Rigel gave a cheer, and the other girls in their grade joined in enthusiastically, until even Flint looked over in annoyance. It was worth the captain's dark scowl to see Draco's confidence bolstered even further as he mounted his broom. Flint loosed 4 bludgers and 3 snitches. The beaters would take aim at both the seekers and one another, but the seeker competition was simple. Whoever caught the first snitch won. It looked more dangerous than a regular game, with no chasers to distract the beaters, and also more challenging. Rigel almost wished she could have tried out after all. Flint blew his whistle, and all 14 players took to the air. "Do you think he'll get it?" Pansy asked. Her clear blue eyes narrowed against the sun. "He's only a first year." Rigel shrugged. "The seeker tryout is straightforward. If he catches it first, it'll be hard to justify denying him a spot." Flint doesn't seem the type to bother justifying himself to anyone. Rigel had no reassuring response to that. They tracked Draco's figure through the sky. He was in good form, Rigel thought, trying to see him objectively. Their practices had honed Draco's ability to change directions quickly, so he was able to avoid the bludgers fairly easily, and his strategy seemed to involve sticking closely to Higgs, the veteran seeker. No one so much as sighted a snitch in the chaos of 4 bludgers and 8 beaters, but there was something both horrifying and beautiful about watching 14 people come so close to disaster so many times in quick succession. Even as his friend, Rigel thought she was unbiased in judging Draco a marvel on a broom. She was no slouch in the air, but Draco flew with an elegance that made him seem born to it, as though his grace on the earth was the true wonder. 20 minutes later, Pansy sighed and sat back in her seat. "Well, I tried. I've been very supportive and patient, and now I'm bored. Rigel, entertain me." Rigel spoke without taking her eyes from the drill. "How can you be bored? We've seen 5 near-deadly accidents so far." "I don't think you can call them accidents if someone is purposely hitting a big steel ball at you and hoping you fall 100 feet to the ground. As a human being, not to mention a Slytherin, you're supposed to be entertained by mindless bloodshed." Rigel heard Pansy's huff of amusement, but she didn't look away from the spectacle until a third voice broke in. "It's far from mindless," Flint said, coming up beside them. He kicked the backs of the seats in front of them, and a couple of third years scurried out of the way so he could prop his feet up when he sat. "This violence serves a very important purpose." "What purpose is that?" Rigel asked. Pansy elbowed her subtly from her other side and gave her a look that asked why the 5th-year Quidditch captain was talking to them. "This little spectacle, while dangerous beyond reason and mostly useless in determining Quidditch potential, is part of a brilliant campaign of misinformation that is vital to our team's success." Flint trained his eyes not on the chaos happening above their heads, but across the pitch at the opposite stands, where students of other houses were also loitering, watching the trial. Pansy leaned around Rigel. "Are you using this tryout as an attempt to intimidate the other teams, Mr. Flint?" Flint gave a bark of his harsh laughter. "Don't ever call me Mr. Anything, it's just Flint, and I'm not attempting, I'm succeeding." Rigel gave a small smile. "They'll think the Slytherin players are dedicated beyond sanity watching this mess." Flint's answering smile was nothing short of vicious. "People deserve to have their expectations met. One glimpse of this will vindicate every assumption about violent, bloodthirsty Slytherins." Pansy made a noise that was only half approving. Flint cut his eyes to the blonde girl, a challenge in his voice. "You don't like my tactics?" Pansy's eyes trailed Draco, who was searching for the snitch in perfect diligence. "I don't presume to know whether the effect on our opponent's morale is worth putting our house members through such a trial when it's just for show." Flint eyed the small pack of Gryffindors in the stands mercilessly. "It is. Smart Money says Wood'll be having his team practice with 4 bludgers within the week. With any luck, one of his chasers gets too injured to play, and we wipe the floor with them." Rigel frowned. "So there is no tryout? You'll be picking the old team no matter what?" "Why not?" Flint shrugged unconcernedly as he watched the unknowing hopefuls battle it out in vain to further the team's consequence. "Already got a good team. No need to add new blood." Rigel looked over at Pansy to see she was looking just as miserably back at her. Draco will be so disappointed. She didn't have long to pity him. Even as she thought it, Higgs went into a steep dive, and Draco was right behind him. Both players weaved between beaters, dodging bludgers, and the crowd grew steadily louder as it became clear that neither was fainting. "Come on, Draco!" Pansy stood from her seat, caught up at last in the excitement. Higgs levelled out, but Draco shot past him, and the crowd erupted as they all realized the two weren't even chasing the same snitch. Higgs caught his just a hair's breadth before Draco, and Flint's whistle cut the rest of the scrimmage short. Rigel and Pansy waited with heavy hearts for Flint to descend back to the pitch and pick his beaters and seeker. They swallowed their disappointment on Draco's behalf, telling one another that he was spectacular and agreeing that he shouldn't find out it was all for nothing from the start. Whatever Flint said to them didn't take long. The pitch began to empty, the rejected hopefuls groaning and gathering their equipment, some angrily, some dejectedly. Rigel and Pansy lagged behind the rest of the spectators as they filed out, and soon they saw a sweaty, red-faced Malfoy pushing quickly up the stairs toward them. Draco dropped his broom when he was close enough and launched himself at them. He ended up half-hugging each of them, his face buried between their shoulders. Pansy nearly overbalanced, and Rigel suppressed a hiss as her left wrist jostled, but she couldn't be angry, not when he'd just suffered such a disappointment. "Can you believe it?" Draco panted, his voice distorted with fatigue. "I know," Pansy patted his head soothingly. "It's quite ridiculous." "Flint's an ass," Rigel agreed. "What?" Draco pulled back with a confused look. Pansy and Rigel exchanged a quick glance to make sure that the other was also now confused. "What?" Rigel repeated. Up close, Draco wasn't nearly as torn up as she'd expected. "Well, whatever, isn't it great?" Draco beamed. "I made the team." They stared at him blankly. Rigel re-spooled her sympathy and cast around for another response in the face of this new, contradictory information. She was not quick enough. "What's with you two?" Draco was looking more put out by the second. "It's only Reserve Seeker, but it's still pretty—" "Oh!" Pansy pulled Draco into a more confident hug. "That's amazing, Draco. Well done. We thought—" Rigel broke off with a sheepish smile. "Well, it looked like Flint wasn't adding any new players to the team." "He didn't." Draco was smiling again, at least. "He picked all the same players as last year, but he said I had so much potential he was taking me on as a reserve to train me up as Higgs' replacement." "High praise coming from the captain." Pansy stepped back to smooth her robes. Draco and Rigel stepped back as well, and Draco admitted, "Well, he didn't say it exactly like that, but that's what he meant." They laughed, and Draco retrieved his broom from where it had rolled under the seats. "Let's head back. Draco, you can get cleaned up, and Rigel can disappear mysteriously until dinner." Pansy softened the suggestion with a smile, but Rigel was feeling too keyed up to think of studying just then. "It's not mysterious if you give me permission." Rigel shook her head mournfully. "I'll have to spend all afternoon with you now, if only to preserve my air of unpredictability besides." She nudged Draco as they started out of the stands. "We have to celebrate this victory together." As they made their way up to the castle, Draco said casually, "Now that I'm on the team, I'll be watching from the players' box." "Good for you." Pansy was waiting for the punchline, but Rigel could already see where this was going. "Oh, but—" she started. Draco cut her off with practiced efficiency. "Not to worry, Rigel. My mother's invitation remains open. I'm sure you'll have a wonderful time watching the first match with my parents, even without my illustrious presence to invigorate you." Draco's bright smile should have been sinister, but he seemed to actually believe his words. "Who will introduce us properly if you aren't even there when we meet?" Rigel argued. It was a perfectly reasonable objection, but her reluctance was much more than an aversion to bad manners. Without Draco there to distract his mother, there was nothing to stop Mrs. Malfoy from noticing all the ways in which Rigel was not like Sirius Black. Nonsense! There was a bounce in Draco's step that said he knew exactly what he was doing. "Pansy gets along famously with my mother. She can introduce you." "But I'm not going to the—" "Oh, yes, you are." Rigel turned to Pansy desperately. "You have to sit in that box with me, Pansy. Please, Pan." "Well, I suppose I was invited originally anyway." Pansy pursed her lips. "Even if there are a limited number of seats, Draco's just given his up. Still, several hours of Quidditch you'll owe me." "Done anything." "You make it sound like you're facing a dragon." Draco scowled. "I'll have you know my mother is perfectly nice." At Pansy's raised eyebrow he added, "To people who don't get on her bad side." "Introductions," Pansy said after a long moment. "We'll trade. I'll go with you and introduce you to Lady Malfoy if you give me a few hours tomorrow to introduce you to people I think you need to know." Rigel hesitated. Pansy had been angling all week to introduce Rigel to her older friends, and Rigel had been avoiding the opportunity, not at all sure how she was going to navigate the political and social waters of Slytherin House just yet. Also, how had Rigel ended up doing something she didn't want to do in both sides of the trade? The Quidditch match was a real threat, however. She did not want to face the Malfoys alone. Her disguise wasn't perfect, and she was certain to do or say something utterly wrong for a pureblood heir without Pansy there to smooth things over. All it took was one mistake, one misstep, and the entire Pretense could fall. "Deal!" Rigel shook on it, and Draco grinned smugly at them both. She didn't know how to feel about being outmaneuvered by a boy who probably only wanted his two best friends and his parents to watch his first match together. On the one hand, it was the kind of complication that she meant to avoid friendship for in the first place. On the other hand, it was impossible to stay angry when he looked so pleased with himself. Calling herself the worst kind of sucker, Rigel resigned herself to being thrust into society by Pansy's well-meaning hands, whether she wanted to or not. We hope you enjoyed this chapter. Please consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon linked in the description, or become a member here on YouTube, where you will get access to several additional chapters weeks before they release on YouTube.